us today. And if you're somewhere in Asia, we would like to wish you good evening. And for those in Europe, good afternoon. My name is Glenn Howard. I'm the president of the Jamestown Foundation, and we're delighted that you're with us today. And joining us as a part of what we call a hybrid session. That's a part of our annual Terrorism Watch Week series. But we're doing things a little bit differently this year because we decided to add a little bit of discussion to China. And what is China doing in Eurasia? And how specifically will terrorism affect its interests in Afghanistan after the U.S. withdrawal? It's quite exciting to have this great group of people here today. And for once, we won't be worrying about U.S. posture in Afghanistan. And now China gets to worry about what's happening in Afghanistan now that we're gone. So as the U.S. departs from the region, now it's up to China to figure out how it's going to control the Taliban and deal with the Uyghurs, deal with the Pakistani Taliban and all the other groups in Islamic State that are operating in Afghanistan. So we're going to bring to you a variety of perspectives today. And I'm delighted to turn this over to my cohort in crime, China Program Manager, John Van Oudenaren from Jamestown, who will now introduce our speakers. And please, for those of you, wait until the discussion is over. We'll be able to try to answer all your questions. And we're going to offer you a very, very interesting and fruitful discussion today. So the title of the event is After the U.S. Withdrawal, China and Afghanistan. John, please take it over.
Thanks so much, Glenn, for that kind introduction. And thanks, everyone, for joining us this morning or evening, depending on where you are. This is the third and final session of our Terrorism Watch Week. And so far, we've talked about developments in Afghanistan and then their implications for the United States. And today, we're going to talk about another critical player in Afghanistan and Central Asia, which is China. And since we've got such a wealth of expertise here, I'm just going to pivot immediately to speaker introductions and then give a very quick overview of the topics we'll run through and let the great experts that we have and practitioners that we have here today talk us through these important and complex issues. So our first speaker is Raffaello Pantucci. He is a senior fellow at the RSIS school in Singapore, and he's the author of a forthcoming book on Sinostan, China's Inadvertent Empire, which focuses on this very topic that we're discussing today. And that'll be out in April 2022. So encourage everyone to maybe pre-order a copy of that. We also have my colleague here with us today, Jacob Zenn, who's an adjunct assistant professor of the Georgetown University Security Studies program and the editor of our Terrorism Monitor, as well as a senior fellow at Jamestown Foundation. We also have Niva Yau, who is joining us from Bishkek. She's a senior researcher at the OSCE Academy there and a fellow in the Eurasia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And finally, we have David R. Stillwell, who until recently served as the top U.S. diplomat for Asia, the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and that was following a 35-year career in the U.S. Air Force. So I think we've really got a fantastic mix of panelists today. A very quick run through of the discussion. We're going to start with Raffaello, who's going to give us an overview of China's security interests and challenges in a post-U.S. Afghanistan. Then we'll turn to Jacob, who's going to look at a matter of great concern for China, which is the potential Uyghur links to militant groups. And we're going to ask Jacob to assess how valid those concerns will be. Then we'll go to Niva, who's going to look at the change and continuity in China's security strategies and policies towards Afghanistan and Central Asia following the U.S. withdrawal. And finally, we'll turn to former Assistant Secretary Stillwell, who's going to look at the implications of post-U.S. Afghanistan for regional and global politics, not only China's approach to the region, but its relations with the U.S. and other key regional actors, Russia, India, Pakistan, Iran, and others. Okay, so with that, I've talked enough. Let's turn it over to Raffaello. Thank you so much, Raffaello, for joining us from Singapore today.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you to Glenn for kindly inviting me to talk to you on this panel with a really great group of experts who I have read and enjoyed working with a great deal in the past. And it's only a shame that we can't do this in person, but I'm happy that we can at least do something together, even in this remote way. I think, I'm going to touch on three kind of principal security concerns that I think China has towards Afghanistan and how I think they're going to try to manage these problems going forwards. And then I also want to touch briefly on the economic side of the picture, because I think that often gets a lot of attention when people are talking about China and Afghanistan. I think slightly the discussion ends up being skewed slightly in the wrong direction. But to start with security threats, China's principal security concern with Afghanistan has been, and I think remains, the fear that the country could become a place where Uyghur dissidents could gather and plot to ultimately try to launch attacks within China or against Chinese interests. This has been an issue that Beijing's been worried about since before the American-led invasion, and it was the source of a number of discussions between Chinese officials and experts through the Pakistanis at the time, with the Taliban government, to try to manage the potential threats and concerns they saw from that. And I think that concern will continue. But I think what's interesting, and I'm not going to linger much on the threat because I think Jake is going to talk more about that. What I think is interesting is the way that China is going to have to try to manage this. Because interestingly, when the US was present in Afghanistan and you had the Afghan Republic in power, you actually had an institution in Kabul that was willing to work with the Chinese to deal with these threats. From the old government's perspective, they looked at the Uyghurs, so the Chinese referred to under the banner ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, though I know it's a name of some contention, but let's stick to that for simplicity's sake right now. The government saw ETIM as working with the Taliban and therefore fighting against them and therefore an adversary they were willing to do something about. And I remember talking to officials of the Republic who would openly say, yes, we've cooperated with the Chinese, and would give me examples of instances where they repatriated Uyghurs that they caught on their territory. With the Taliban, this is a very different proposition. The Taliban have bled and fought alongside these Uyghur groups for the past 20 years and ultimately won a glorious conflict against the United States alongside them. This is, for them, it's going to be a very different equation to just turn on this group and suddenly hand them over to the Chinese. And so the relationship that in a way was quite stable from Beijing's perspective has suddenly been completely upended. And I think that means that this issue is going to be one that you'll consistently see as a preponderant concern. Now, how is China going to manage this? So I think they're going to manage this in part through a direct engagement with the Taliban, and we can see this happening already. And you'll see that at every engagement, the question of ETIM or Uyghurs is brought up in reference, and is something they continue to exert pressure on the Taliban to do something about. But at the same time, you can see the Chinese are continuing to hedge in other ways as well and build up other forms of assurance. Part of this is the bases that we've seen them building up in Tajikistan and the security support they provided for Tajik forces to help strengthen their border on the Wuhan corridor, which is, a sort of secondary border, if you will, for China to Afghanistan. And then on the other side, in Pakistan, the Chinese have a long history of supporting and cooperating with the Pakistani security forces, and I think we'll continue to work through them to try to mitigate and create another buffer of protection from this perceived threat that they see. And I do think that remains sort of one of their major concerns that will always continue, and I think, animate Chinese strategic thinking when looking towards Afghanistan. A second issue, which I think has been upended to some degree, is the question of what kind of how instability in Afghanistan may potentially overspill into Central Asia or Pakistan. If we go back again and look at the 1990s, there were a number of instances that took place in Central Asia, which were linked to militant networks that ultimately emanated from Afghanistan or had a footprint in Afghanistan. Now, China's relationship with Central Asia has transformed over the past few years, and I'm sure Niva is going to talk about this more. But I think the key thing is China has a lot more economic interests, a lot more people, and a lot more presence on the ground, which are potential targets for militant groups. And we've seen, the only or one of the few attacks, a conscious, purposeful attack targeting of a Chinese embassy by a militant group happened, of course, in Bishkek in May 2016, when a group of militant Uyghurs with links to Syria tried to did detonate a bomb. The explosion didn't actually kill anybody in the building at the Chinese embassy in Bishkek. So this is a very live concern from a Chinese perspective, and this concern that the instability might spread north into Central Asia, or a far more, I think, real concern, spill south into Pakistan and create greater instability there. Pakistan is a country that Chinese are massively invested in, and were, Pakistan or Central Asia and the entire region becoming unstable, China would suddenly find that Xinjiang, a region that it's very concerned about, it sees as a place that requires a great deal of stability and security investment, would suddenly be in a neighborhood that was very unstable. And that will create a whole series of potential concerns for China directly, as well as its interests in these countries next door. I think the third issue or security concern that I think you can see emanating from the Chinese discourse when they're looking at what threats might come from Afghanistan going forwards is the potential for outside powers, adversary powers like the United States or like India, use Afghanistan as a place from which they could manipulate proxies of some sort against China. We've already seen a number of accusations thrown by the Chinese that the Americans are doing this already in terms of Uyghur militant groups, though recently this rhetoric has been toned down a bit. And there's a long history of sort of paranoia about Indian involvement in Afghanistan. Mostly this has been frankly stirred up by Pakistanis who see sort of, militant groups that they're worried about, like Baluchis or Sindhis, using Afghanistan as a base from which to foment trouble in Pakistan. By the way, trouble that increasingly in the past years we've seen has been steered towards Chinese interests in Pakistan. But we also see that there's a potential that this could transform into a place of sort of proxy conflict for China with the against the United States or against India. And I think this is a kind of a relatively live security concern, and one that maybe falls sort of a little lower down the rank of concerns of the other two that I mentioned, but I think is something that China is preoccupied about. And I think you can see this in some of the rhetoric that we see coming out from Beijing when they're looking at how they talk about Afghanistan and how they're engaging with the region on some of these questions. So I think those are the three kind of principal security issues and challenges that I think Beijing sees when it looks to Afghanistan in the short to medium term future. I think on the other side of the coin, it's interesting to look at the economic picture, because I think what's interesting about the economic picture is that from a Chinese perspective, there is always that question of the economics underpins the long-term stability. This is very much, I think, the thinking that's centered on what they've been trying to do in Xinjiang over the past, 20 or so years, where you can see this combination of a very heavy security presence, but a very long-term kind of economic approach. Ultimately hoping that eventually, the strong security presence now will stabilize the situation, but the economic approach will mean that longer term people will be, prosperous, rich and happy and not want to rebel against the state. And in that way, China will sort of, create stability. And this is a kind of model that they push outside as well. Now, I think what's interesting is that you can see this model to some degree being deployed in Afghanistan. And I don't think it's being deployed in the way often that is focused on, which is this idea that China is going to suddenly sweep in with its large state-owned enterprises and undertake large mining concessions and projects in Afghanistan. China, when the Republic was in power, was the only power that actually had invested in any major substance in Afghanistan, or at least signed contracts. The projects themselves didn't actually really move very far forwards, but, at least Chinese companies had bid and won, very substantial concessions in a copper mine in Messainak and a oil field up in Amu Darya. And these two projects stalled and didn't really deliver much. And frankly, for the Republic government, they were an irritant because they would constantly ask the Chinese to get moving on it. The Chinese say, oh, well, there's an issue, there was an issue. And, in the end, in fact, the Amu Darya deal was taken back by the government to be dealt with separately. But the government fell apart and we are where we are today. Now, we continue to see now how CMPC and MCC, the two companies, that were managing those two projects, have started to make an appearance in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan and have sent, engineers to do feasibility studies and explore a little bit the opportunities. Very much something that's been encouraged by the Taliban government, who can see that these projects are ones that, could get going and could bring real benefit to Afghanistan. But at the same time, there's been very little push of actually trying to get these projects going. What we have seen instead is a very interesting other set of engagements where we've seen the Chinese reopen an air corridor getting Afghan pine nuts into the Chinese market. Now, this may seem slightly frivolous. Pine nuts is not really going to be the sort of economy that's going to completely transform Afghanistan, a country that needs massive investment into all sorts of areas to stabilize. But I think what's critical about this is that it gives China an opportunity to influence and get cash in the hands of farmers, a large number of farmers. And so in a way, this helps spread around some wealth within Afghanistan in a way that's at very little cost to China. All China needs to do is essentially help subsidize a flight going back and forth, bringing the pine nuts to China. Once they're in China, they sell them on the open market in China. And we've seen this through sort of online platforms, and it sells very quickly. The first plane load that went over, I think, was sold out in like an hour or something on one of these very prominent online shopping channels in China. And if we look at other areas as well, when we look at mining, I think focusing on these big concession projects, I mean, it's possible that we might start to see them going, but I think there's still a lot of challenges, a lot of infrastructure that needs to be put in place before they're able to actually get going. What we are more likely to see, and you are already seeing some evidence of, is more smaller scale artisanal miners or individual entrepreneurial Chinese moving into Afghanistan and essentially seeing an opportunity. They find a small mine, they work with some locals, they start to take advantage of the opportunity and get that back to the market in China. We can see this with small steel mills as well. There's an awful lot of scrap metal lying around Afghanistan, and you can see a lot of steel mills are appearing to basically reprocess this and then offer it back to the Afghan market. Now, this is a very interesting sort of entrepreneurial shift, because this is something that ultimately the state is allowing, because these individuals are able to sort of travel back and forth, and travel from China is controlled. But at the same time, it's one that requires very little actual central government investment and ultimately very little central government exposure, which is, I think, the key thing I want to end on, which is that all that we've seen China do on the economic side and even on the security side is essentially demonstrate a level of interest, appetite, and activity which is supportive of the government. China's concerned that whatever government there is in power now, the Taliban-led one, stays in power. Not necessarily because they absolutely love them, but because it's stable and it controls the country. And they want that. What they're more concerned about is that the whole situation falls apart. And so they're suddenly stuck with a situation of a completely fragmented and chaotic Afghanistan. And so within that context, they don't want to overcommit. And by overcommitting, that would be sending, the large, big state-owned enterprises with all the sort of issues that would be attached to them, but rather you sort of allow this increasing flow back and forth, which allows a certain volume of economic activity, which helps Afghanistan without forcing China to really commit and be seen as ultimately, a replacement for the United States in the country with all the problems that are attendant with that. And I'll stop there and hand it, I guess, back to John to keep the discussion moving. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Raffaello. Let's now turn to Jacob, who's going to drill down a little bit on that and talk about a matter of great importance to China, which is the Uyghurs in Afghanistan and what potential role they may play. So Jacob, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to contribute to this panel, and I look forward to seeing the way that my discussion and the discussion of the other panelists is synchronized, or whether there might be some differences that will iron out. For the most part, I think there will be a lot similar. One thing that I notice about China's rhetoric regarding the Uyghurs is that it has changed since the post 9/11 era. And I think that's a reflection of China's increasing power and weight globally and in Asia. Right after 9/11, whenever China wanted a seat on the international stage regarding a regional security role or an international counterterrorism role, China would always point to this vague group called ITIM, which, as Raffaello mentioned, isn't actually the name of a particular group. And it said, because of the threat of ITIM, we need to do this, or because of the threat of ITIM, we need to undergo these domestic counterterrorism measures. I have not seen that same rhetoric from China in recent months, or even necessarily the past years. I don't think it necessarily points to ITIM as this major threat as much as it used to. Now it throws its weight saying, to contribute to regional stability, China needs to be there. And I think that's somewhat of a broader perspective of China towards its role in the region. In other words, it doesn't need to point to this one particular group to justify China's seat at the table. China now views itself as a contributor to regional security, and that's a much broader reason for China to be active. And as a result of China's desire to contribute to regional security, it can try to assert itself in countries like Tajikistan and establish a military presence there. It can try to assert itself in Afghanistan, especially near the Chinese border, and Pakistan, if not other countries. So we've seen a broadening of what China considers its reason for having a seat at the security table in Asia. And as for ETIM itself, I actually think the threat from ETIM has, in a strange way, circled back to a similar threat that it was before 9/11, which is not necessarily that much to China. And I'll explain that here. As anyone who studied the Uyghur militancy knows, there's been a trickle of Uyghur militancy from Xinjiang to Afghanistan since even before 9/11, with some Uyghurs obtaining very high roles in Al-Qaeda even before 9/11. And then after 9/11, the perhaps several dozen, perhaps up to 100 Uyghur militants in Afghanistan were mostly subsumed under the bigger Islamic movement of Uzbekistan or other outfits, notwithstanding some individual Uyghurs playing high roles in Al-Qaeda. In 2006, as Terrorism Monitor has written about, the Uyghurs in Afghanistan obtained a more formal designation as Turkestan Islamic Party, and they had a very flashy propaganda wing. And perhaps their propaganda was more impressive than their actual militancy. In fact, a lot of their propaganda eventually was about militants dying because they were based near Taliban or Al-Qaeda leaders. And so this Turkestan Islamic Party did not carry out many attacks in Afghanistan. A big change was 2009 with the riots in Urumqi, Xinjiang, and the many deaths that happened there. And after that, China began a much stronger domestic role to counter separatism, as it considered it, extremism, and divisiveness, these types of issues. At the same time, you saw Turkey in 2009 with Erdogan saying that there was some type of genocide in Xinjiang. And you began to see a much stronger Uyghur diaspora militant or anti-China movement evolving in Turkey. Soon after that, in 2012, we had the Syrian war. And this is something I know Raffaello also reported on at the time. But you saw a big shift of Uyghur militants from Afghanistan to Syria. And the Uyghur militancy in Afghanistan became very low. But the Uyghur militancy in Syria became very large. In fact, they were major contributors to Al-Qaeda in a way that the Uyghurs in Afghanistan had never been to the Taliban. And you did see ISIS try to win over Uyghur recruits in Syria, but they weren't particularly successful. Now, with the Syrian situation becoming more status quo, you still see Uyghurs in Syria contributing to Al-Qaeda and less so to ISIS in Syria. But you have seen a little bit of a resurgence of Uyghur, at least propaganda, from the Turkestan Islamic Party in Afghanistan in recent months. So there's definitely a presence of the Turkestan Islamic Party in Afghanistan now. And what we see from their propaganda is that they have formal uniforms, flashy videos, and all the trappings of a high quality media outfit, which reflects professionalization. That to me also indicates that the Taliban doesn't have full control over Uyghur militancy in Afghanistan, because I don't think it's in the Taliban's interest for the Uyghur militants in Afghanistan to release these propaganda videos, because it means that China has more justification to assert itself in Afghanistan and to accuse the Taliban of not doing enough to stamp out Uyghur militancy. And that, of course, would affect the Taliban's relationship with Pakistan. At the same time, it is possible that the Taliban allows some of these videos for two reasons. One, it can demonstrate to China that don't push us too hard because we do have this lever against you. Because the Taliban seems to be using that same lever against Pakistan with the Pakistani Taliban, saying, we do have some levers with the Pakistani Taliban, so don't push us too hard either. And another reason why the Taliban might allow the Uyghur militants in Afghanistan to release some of these videos is because they don't want to be seen as sort of oppressing the Uyghur militants. I mean, it's clear that the Taliban does not want Uyghur militants to go to China and carry out attacks, because that would really damage the Taliban's ability to gain international credibility when it's struggling with that from the US side. Then it would be struggling with the Chinese side. But by allowing the Uyghur militants to engage in some activities, it will allow the Uyghur militants to be at least somewhat satisfied. And that's also important for the Taliban because you see ISIS trying to recruit the Uyghur militants in Afghanistan from the Turkestan Islamic Party. And the justification from ISIS in Afghanistan, ISIS Khorasan province, is that look at the Taliban making these economic and security deals with China. They've clearly sold out to infidels. I mean, this is beautiful for ISIS propaganda. So if the Taliban not only engages China as well as the broader international, the Uyghur militants, you need to disarm, you need to leave the country, you can't make videos or whatnot. That's a real boon towards ISIS Khorasan, which itself is, of course, engaging in a war against the Taliban. That said, the reason why I think the Uyghur militant threat is similar to the post-9/11 era, which is not too much, is that at the end of the day, right now, the Uyghur militants in Afghanistan are mostly engaging in propaganda making. We don't see the Uyghurs carrying out major attacks. I don't doubt that they contribute to some of them, but they're mostly interested in conveying their presence in Afghanistan rather than contributing to major operations, which differs from the Uyghurs in Syria who contribute to major operations. So in sum, I think China does not need to worry much about Uyghurs from Afghanistan penetrating into China, not only because China has its own border security, but also because the Taliban has an interest in preventing that. And domestically, China has engaged in a number of heavy-handed measures that are well reported on in Xinjiang that have basically brought any type of Uyghur rebellion or Uyghur militancy to almost zero in the country, which also differs from the post-2009 era when you did see increasingly frequent attacks by semi-organized Uyghur militants in not only Xinjiang, but also Yunnan province and other parts of the country. And so in conclusion, what I'd say is that not only is China not facing major threats from Uyghur militants in Afghanistan, but its rhetoric also reflects that it's not only Uyghur militancy that China is using to justify its role in Afghanistan or Central Asia and South Asia, but just broader regional stability is China's justification for being there. That said, you cannot deny the Uyghur militant presence. And as China furthers its economic entrenchment in Afghanistan, if not also Tajikistan and Pakistan, this could lead to openings for Uyghur militants to conduct attacks on particularly Chinese business people or personnel. And there could be the potential for more Uyghur defections from a broader Taliban-aligned posture towards a posture more aligned perhaps with the Pakistani Taliban, which is adverse to the Pakistani state in China, or to ISIS itself. And you had been seeing that trend occur in terms of Al-Qaeda loyalty switching to ISIS in Afghanistan and Syria in the occur in Afghanistan as well, where Uyghur militancy begins to shift towards ISIS. So I'll conclude on that note.
Thanks, Jacob. Appreciate that, those insights. Let's now turn to Niva, who's going to zoom out a little bit and take a look at how the U.S. withdrawal has impacted China's approach to neighboring states in Central Asia. Niva, thank you.
Thanks. We're doing really great on time. So this is great. It's really great also to be part of Jamestown's Terrorism Week of events. Thanks for having me. Thanks for, of course, including a voice from Central Asia and looking at this region as well when talking about Afghanistan, because you know, the Afghanistan issue has always been part of China's discussions with Central Asian leaders. And I think Raffael and Jacob already covered very well about how China feels about the Uyghurs and also, you know, some bits about Central Asia as well. And all of this is very useful for our discussion. I'd like to zoom in a little bit and talk more about how things are here on the ground. And quite frankly, this is the perspective I find a little bit more relevant if we were to look at how China's security engagement works in this region in the past, and also how they're going to evolve moving forward. The main threat for China regionally does not come from the small border between China and Afghanistan. It is perceived by China that it will come from the radicalization in Central Asia that will overspill from here to Xinjiang because of human exchanges, family, business links between Central Asia and Xinjiang, of course. There are very large populations in Central Asia, and they are growingly so, and these populations have been neglected by economic development, and they find comfort in religion, in Islam. In my past 3 years living here in this region, I can see that Islamic promotion is increasing at a massively rapid rate, and not just offline, we're talking about online, on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube. And also the entry of Islamic leaders into politics as well it's been very fast in the past couple of years. This is the first concern for China. The second concern is how this radicalization can impact Chinese investments in Central Asia. And Raphael already touched on this a little bit. Over 80% of China Central Asia trade is actually in the oil and gas. So all of these are investments, in the billions, and they are exposed on the ground. The pipeline is on the ground. It's not underground. It's on the ground. You can see it with your own eyes. You can touch it with your own hands. And will this radicalization support the East Turkestan movement or not? Jacob talked a little bit about how real they are, but the fact is there are still sympathizers of the Uyghur independence movement that live here in this region. Who are either themselves Uyghur or themselves other Chinese ethnic minorities that are carefully being monitored by China. In this discussion, usually scholars don't really talk about this ethnic group called Dongan, which are actually Chinese Muslims. They are Han Chinese, but they've been converted into Muslims, and they are the group that China actually keeps a very close eye on. So whether or not they support the East Turkestan or whether or not they support Xinjiang independence movement is something that very much concerns China. Do they have connections with Uyghur militants? Are they letting them enter Central Asia or not, through visas, through business links, through family links, through marriages? This is a second concern for China. This requires a tremendous amount of effort, long-term, to manage this problem of radicalization and kind of this, assimilation with the locals, and how, turning locals kind of ideology towards China and supporting independence movement or not. This has so much implication for the Belt and Road Initiative, which goes through Central Asia primarily first, of course. And, one of the concern with this, whole BRI is whether or not it is possible for China to think about connecting Central Asia and South Asia economically, and, human mobility and trains and pipelines and so on and so forth. If radicalization in Central Asia is for certain, then connecting with South Asia is going to make it even worse. So this is a very long-term concern. And dealing with these concerns of, regional radicalization and Xinjiang instability for the past 20 years, China's security strategy and policies have all been about increasing Central Asia's own security capacity and ensuring a China-led coordinated regional effort against terrorism. So multilaterally, of course, China worked through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, which is something that's been talked a lot more about recently. There have been 16 multilateral security exercises since 2003 under the SCO. There are also additional exercises through the SCO's regular security structure, which is called RATS, unfortunately. It's the Regional Anti-Terrorism Structure, which, of course, all the speakers here are familiar with. Whether or not they're effective is not the point of the discussion, but what I'm trying to say is that this is how China is working through to kind of support Central Asia security capacity. Since 2014, under the SCO, there are also joint army trainings. They're very small scale, but these are kind of just tactics, terrains, equipment use. They're very small scale. There are also non-traditional security exercises, for example, focusing on cybersecurity. Since 2015, there's been 3 so far, and the most recent one actually focused on looking at the promotion of foreign fighter recruitment ads on Instagram and on Telegram groups. So this is very much signaling the fact that, China does care about this radicalization amongst young people online. This is a very kind of new concern for China and also for leaders in this region as well. But these are multilateral engagement, right? But bilateral security engagement is actually much more active and much more diverse than the multilateral activities. There have been about 12 bilateral security exercises between China and Central Asian states since 2002, 9 of which were conducted with Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. The borders are extremely porous. They are mountains. If you are a militant and you know your way, you can cross them into China if that's what you're aiming to do. These are exercises that particularly involve border guards from Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and China, and the armed police, which are actually much more realistic deployments from the Chinese side in the case of responding to terrorist attacks and mobilization, for example, from Central Asia. There are also a lot of military and security-related trainings as well provided by China to Central Asia, Central Asian military and police, focusing on Chinese sharing experiences on specific topics like anti-terrorism, cybersecurity, investigative technology, crowd control, anti-drug trafficking, and pipeline security, many things. And it's not just teaching how they're doing it, but also sharing the equipment they're using when they're doing it, and giving out the equipment as well as gifts is also very common. There are also security equipment transfers in general at a state level and donations, like providing salaries directly to Kyrgyz and Tajik border guards. And all of this is, increasing security capacity, making sure there's men on the ground, making sure that these men are, have a connection to China and, many interactions. There's also, and this is only in the past couple of years, there's an introduction of Chinese private security companies here in Central Asia. There was one in Afghanistan as well that was based in Kabul. All of them are extremely new to the business. So you cannot compare them to American private security companies. You cannot compare them to the Russian one, to the French one in Africa. They are very immature in their practices. They are only serving Chinese clients and providing, like bodyguards that speak Chinese, for example. They're very immature. But going forward, bilateral security engagements are likely to continue and expand, and they will manifest in many different ways. It is much more efficient for Beijing to individually speak with a Central Asian leader and agree on a security engagement than to get a group agreement. I think, this has been quite clear after the fall of Kabul in August. The SCO didn't come to terms with anything at all. I remember Rafa and I were, watching the summit online, and they didn't agree on anything at all. The statements they were making were vague. There was no consensus, basically. But China is working individually with Tajikistan, and most recently we saw that China is opening a new facility, a police facility on the Tajikistan-Afghanistan border. And we can expect more of these kinds of bilateral security engagements are obviously on their way.
Thank you so much, Niva. Okay, we're now going to turn to our final speaker, who is David Stillwell, and I'm going to get his slides up here. Everyone see the slides?
It's good.
All right, David, over to you. He's going to talk us through the broader geostrategic dynamics at play here.
Thanks. And let me just start off with a story. I was in Beijing as a defense attaché, and in 2012, I was asked to do a presentation on American policy in the region and in the Middle East. And I said, here's why we're doing it. Here's American intent in Afghanistan, all this stuff. My PLA counterpart was, wagging his finger in my face. He says, you're imperialists. You're only there to extract. You're giving nothing back, and you should leave. And so I said, and you're right. We should, and we will. And and I sort of got in front of the headlights, says we'll be leaving very soon. And he was like, good. He's stomping his feet. When it was over, we went back behind the curtains in the green room, and he's going, please, God, no, don't leave. We're not prepared yet to deal with unrest and all the things that Niva just talked about in Central Asia and especially in Afghanistan. So I think that's telling the PRC approach to this. They were actually very grateful that we were protecting their Western flank. And so the first three speakers done a great job of detailing the issues in the region, which, I'm not that up to speed on, but what I can tell you is we've got some structural issues in defense and state and US government that we're going to have to deal with here if we're going to address this in any sort of a coherent way. The trouble I see and the things that we have to address are just lines on maps. If you look at that first black line at the bottom, State Department, it drives between Bangladesh and Burma. This was my area. And on the left side, that is the South Central Asia Bureau. And then I'm East Asia Pacific on the right. And that really bothered me that my counterparts over in SCA looked at Central Asia in a completely different and, in my view, non-strategic way, while I was trying to stitch it into a larger approach to the PRC. Worse, unfortunately, is the line that red line DOD has drawn, and that goes between India and Pakistan and then follows the State Department line on the western border of China. So what you have here is like fully half of the American security apparatus looking at the same major problem as identified in 2017 National Security Strategy. China is a strategic competitor and ranked at the top of major issues we need to work on, but we're looking at it from two different perspectives. It's probably still not unusual to hear someone at CENTCOM in Tampa talk about China as a potential counterpart and collaborator and assist in stabilizing Afghanistan post-US withdrawal. They can be excused for that, but I think that is backward thinking, and we definitely need to rethink this process and take a more macro view of the region and its contributions to U.S. security planning and policy. I've got bases listed on there; those are important. The one in the letters DoD there at the bottom at Gwadar is interesting. We talked a lot about how China is doing a reasonable job in bringing the Belt Road stuff through Central Asia. They're addressing the questions about prosperity and the rest. But if you saw this week, there was an article on some protests at Gwadar, and these aren't the first. And it raises a security issue, again, back to my defense friends and my former colleagues, of protecting infrastructure. When I first heard about the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, I could just imagine every Friday after prayers in the tribal areas, we would be doing RPG practice on the Chinese pipeline. That seemed entirely reasonable. And the same for the infrastructure going through Niva's neck of the woods there as it drives toward Europe. And so my goal, as I was speaking to my PLA friend in 2012, is we've been bearing the burden of security on your western border for a long time, and now you need to consider how you're going to address that. And it's not easy. And as we're seeing with our lips and teeth all-weather partner Pakistan, if you're in Beijing, it's actually making the relationship more difficult. So we're going to have to choose. We're going to have to choose which posture CENTCOM, SCA, EAP, and Indo-PACOM take in addressing this issue. And I would strongly suggest that my government friends take a more holistic and broad view, as this map shows. Next slide, please. And so I was just, when I first got to this job at State, I was wondering, how am I going to do this? How am I going to get, myself and the people in my bureau to start thinking more broadly? And so this was the map I had done in my office. The original map stopped at Bangladesh, and then it drove straight north, cutting off Tibet, Xinjiang, and all the rest. And that was how EAP looked at its region. We came up with a new map that includes, Central Asia and Afghanistan and the rest and India for good reason, because these are all parts of this issue that we need to consider as we develop U.S. policy. And the first three presenters, I think your voices are very important and hopefully are being heard in DC as we move forward. As a tactical issue, I'm very concerned that we will continue with our habits of looking to bail Pakistan out, of the debt that they've found themselves in with the PRC, with CPEC and other things, and of the increasing PRC presence in Pakistan that they find distasteful. And if you look at what Afghanistan looks like in the future, I imagine it's going to look like that as well. We've already seen smaller incidents. So not only are we dealing with Uyghur and other folks who would like to move into Western China and perhaps create some instability, but we're looking at instability inside Afghanistan as well, as we start to see what so far has proven a fairly tone-deaf and heavy-handed presence by PRC business, military, and government in the region. So in short, I think, and we're done with slides here, I think if we just take a more macro view, and as you deal with your US government and other counterparts, help them think about these things in a much larger terms, in terms of the broader continent versus these very arbitrary and unfortunately very unhelpful lines that we've dealt with to date. So with that, I'll give you some time back and look forward to questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dave, and really appreciate you getting up so early in Hawaii to lend your insights to this panel. So I think that really sets us up well for a good discussion here. I know we've got a great and well-informed audience, so you can either type your question in the chat box or raise your hand, your virtual hand, to ask a question, and then I will allow you to talk. So I guess maybe I will start things off here. We saw, China's no stranger to the sort of Afghanistan's reputation as a quote unquote graveyard of empires. And we saw this kind of covered ad nauseum by Chinese state media during the US presence there. And of course, China also played a significant role in the Soviet debacle in Afghanistan. My question for the panel is, does China think that it can get Afghanistan right? Can it do it differently than past powers? And if so, are there good reasons for that belief? Perhaps because of this kind of different approach that Raffaello had talked a little bit about, or perhaps is this maybe some hubris on Beijing's part? So I'm looking at you, Raffaello, as maybe the first person to kind of take that on, but also welcome follow-ons from the rest of the panel.
Thank you, John. I think that's a really interesting question. Look, I think there's a reason you kept reading that phrase in the Chinese literature, and that's because that's what they believe. And I think they're very worried about being the next empire to get sucked into this morass. So I think that actually a lot of what you've seen them doing is hedging. But the problem is that now they're hedging from a position of being the second largest economy on the planet and, increasingly a global power. And so it's not the China that it was, 20 years ago when the US went in, which is a power which is still kind of developing on the world stage. The narrative of China's rise is very different. The discourse about where China stood on the kind of geopolitical stage is very different. Whereas now that's transformed. And China is, without any doubt, the most powerful power on, Afghanistan's borders. So the idea that it can't play a role seems impossible to conceive in a way, because of course it's going to have to play a role because it's the kind of biggest player in the box. But I think what's interesting is that China's doing everything it can to avoid getting caught in that situation and making sure that anything it does, which is going to end up with it being left, carrying the can, is only going to happen if it's doing it with someone else. And at the moment, they're trying desperately to get the Russians to go first in terms of acknowledging and recognizing the Taliban government, and then they'll follow. The Pakistanis, of course, do it in a heartbeat, but that's not kind of enough. The Chinese need another UNSC member to recognize it, and then they can sort of step in behind them. So I think there's a great eagerness from China not to step into that role. And I think that, I think the hubris that you talk about is certainly real, but I worry that the hubris is going to express itself in other ways instead, in terms of overcommitting, in terms of getting themselves caught into situations rather than trying to resolve the situation there. I think it's more a case of, misstepping and finding themselves stuck, but not stuck in the same way that the US got stuck in the US for trying to fix this country. I think the Chinese said the Afghans will have their own history and whatever. It's a question of how much of their own interests get stuck in there without the government ultimately feeling like they own the situation and have to fix it. I'll stop there and look forward to hearing the others' thoughts as well.
Great. And well, I guess that kind of tees us up, I think, for a good question from Claudia Rosset, which you kind of just touched on, Raffaello, which is looking at Russia's role in Afghanistan. And we know, of course, I haven't had a chance to look at the readout yet, but there was a summit, of course, a virtual summit between Xi and Putin today. I don't think Afghanistan was at the top of the agenda, given developments in Ukraine and the U.S. Democracy Summit and the reaction against that. But it's still an area, where Russia and China are trying to sync up. So could you, anyone on the panel, talk a little bit about Russia's role, not just in Afghanistan, but in the context of Russia's role as a major player in the region in Central Asia as well?
I'm happy to try to tackle that, but I also aware that there are lots of other brilliant people on this panel. I mean, I think Russia's got an interesting role. I think that, it was mentioned, I think I saw some of the quick readouts that came out from the Puxi summit, and I know they've had some discussions in the past specifically about Afghanistan, but my understanding is that there's kind of a level of tension in there. And it's quite interesting how it's expressed itself. I think the Russians have been quite frustrated by the way that things have played out. They were hoping that the Taliban government was going to be a bit more inclusive. They bet, I think, on other actors who ultimately didn't come to power in the sort of factions. So there's been a level of frustration. We've seen, while Moscow has been very willing to engage with the Taliban, they still talk of them as a terrorist group. It's still a prescribed group for them, and they still are being a bit wary. But at the same time, I think, and I think here it'd be interesting to hear a bit from Niva, I think, is, the Russians are the ones who are putting a lot of hard security power into Central Asia to help strengthen those borders. They're the ones who did the training exercise with the Tajiks and the Uzbeks. They're the ones who rushed through lots of military sales in the run up, after the Afghan Republic collapsed. This was Russia that was doing that. It wasn't China. China did some small investments and some small projects and some more training exercises, but it was really focused on its particular interest, which is that border with Tajikistan. Whereas Russia took a much more owned, responsible view of Central Asia as a place that it needed to play a role. So I think you've always got that kind of distinction in a way between the two of them. And I think what's interesting is the degree to which they may be trying to coordinate. And at the moment, it's difficult to see exactly what that coordination looks like. At the moment, it seems more like the two of them seem to be working in parallel and willing to engage with each other in the various regional formats that they're advancing forwards. At the same time, it hasn't quite synced up into a sort of coherent action to do something. And I think, the SCO, for example, would be the obvious place for something like that to start. And yet I've seen very little evidence of the SCO actually making any tangible moves in this direction. They talk a lot, they do a lot of meetings, and they host a lot of training exercises. But when, the rubber hits the road, you don't see people going to, the SCO to really get stuff done.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in just now, but I think my internet was very unstable. I hope everyone can hear me now. I think, Russia also don't want to see radical Islam at its border either. There are millions of Tajiks and Kyrgyz that work in Russia as low-skilled workers, and obviously, how the way that Taliban is kind of inspiring Central Asians to actually use Islamic thinking into their kind of political ideology and their political engagement, and their in their opposition is actually very worrying for Russia, I think also. I think, in relation to China, I read from a couple of scholars that, China, is quite concerned about, having Russia take this opportunity, to really show to Central Asia that it is the only security provider for the region, is something that's quite concerning to China. I mean, for years, China is just providing economic opportunities to this region, of course. But, in the past 30 years, if you look at the economy here, there's zero diversification. there is zero growth in the sense that, you know, the money is not getting to the local population. People are frustrated. People do not see that, you know, economic engagement with China is actually beneficial on their end. And, you know, at the same time, China is trying to engage a little bit more kind of in this on the security front, but facing this kind of changed situation in Afghanistan, actually everyone is looking at China thinking that, wow, it's actually a useless partner for us. You know, countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, they are still working with Russia, only talking to Russia regarding, you know, the issues, you know, concerning Afghanistan. You see Chinese ambassadors, you know, going to the Central Asians, MFA and their partners, asking, okay, what's going on, asking for information. But, you know, these discussions are not cooperation discussion. These discussions are information exchange and sharing. And I think, you know, this is a big worry for China, because, you know, if Russia steps in, you know, a little bit more aggressively because of Afghanistan, then this is it. China is stuck here. And, you know, at the same time, you start to see Central Asian states becoming a little bit more independent, a little bit more, you know, have their own individual thinking. You know, for example, Uzbekistan is taking, you know, this opportunity to connect with Afghanistan and connecting with the US and being very independent from Russia, being very independent from China. Is actually taking this opportunity to gain economic entry into South Asia. So all of this has, you know, consequences for China's economic leverage, which is already in decline. You know, with this kind of introduction of, you know, opportunity to work with South Asia, you know, China's own position in this region is already at risk.
Thanks. Niva, you cut out there for a second.
Yep.
Yes, I can hear you. You had cut out there for a second, Niva.
What was the last thing that you heard?
You were talking about the Russian, the sort of Uzbekistan taking a more, taking advantage of the situation to follow kind of a more independent approach to regional affairs.
Yeah, I think eventually, essentially, you know, the closing remark that I was going for was that, you know, China's main leverage here is economic. And even with, you know, the current situation, you know, this leverage is already declining. With Russia's, you know, stepping in on the security front, you know, overall China's game here is losing.
That's a fascinating point. Thanks, Steve. And I think that kind of runs counter to a lot of the perceptions here in Washington. I want to turn over to Glenn here, who had a couple questions. The first one had to do with the Uyghurs and ISIS-K for Jacob. Glenn, do you want to ask your question in person here?
Yeah, Jacob, you've covered a lot of things related to Islamic State and your role in Terrorism Monitor. Can you tell us just a little bit about how Islamic State Khorasan in Afghanistan has been using Uyghurs, recruiting them as suicide bombers and using them against the Taliban? This is not directly aimed against China, but it's very obvious when Taliban can now trying to control and consolidate Afghanistan. And then you've got this irritating problem in Nangarhar province where the Islamic State Khorasan is now recruiting Uyghurs. How do you think that plays out? And kind of tell us what's been happening, just briefly kind of review that.
One of the interesting things about ISIS Khorasan as it pertains to, or ISIS in general, as it pertains to certain ethnic groups globally, is that some of them, it comes late in the game too. Like just for example, in Africa, although ISIS was active in Libya, it was sort of late in trying to recruit some of the tribes from southern Libya, like the Tubus. And it actually seems to me that for whatever reason, the Uyghurs have generally been in while until you started to see aggressive ISIS campaigning towards the Uyghurs, even though as early as 2011 and 2012, you saw Uyghurs being campaign. So actually, the ISIS recruitment campaign of Uyghurs in Afghanistan has only begun quite recently, largely following the Taliban victory in Kabul and the Taliban continued outreach to China. And that was best evidenced by a suicide bombing attack on a Shia mosque in northern Afghanistan, where ISIS several weeks ago announced that the attacker was in fact a Uyghur. So it's only very new parcel of its recruitment strategy in Afghanistan. And we don't know yet how much it will continue, but it will likely relate to, one, how close the Taliban gets to China, which is right now fairly close, and what measures the Taliban takes to constrain Uyghur militancy, including its propaganda and its activities. And if the Taliban continues to do that, I would expect more Uyghur. There aren't so many Uyghur militants in Afghanistan that they can make a huge difference operationally, where they can do that in Syria, but they can become valuable propaganda for ISIS in Afghanistan, like for suicide bombings and individual attacks. So I don't necessarily think Uyghurs will be a game changer in the ISIS-Taliban relationships, but it will be a lever to continue to use against the Taliban in terms of propaganda to diminish the Taliban's Islamic credibility and perhaps win recruits from other ethnicities, including Pashtuns, towards ISIS on grounds that the Taliban is selling out Uyghur brethren in China. Sorry. Mute.
Thanks, Jacob. I'd like to turn now to one of our audience Q&As from Avijit Biswas. I think this is a good question. The question is, will China, it's about China's counterterrorism strategy. Will they be selective in targeting certain groups such as ETIM or TIP, I guess they're similar, and then turn a blind eye to other groups? I think the question is specifically referring to, of course, Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan, which China has typically been reticent to participate in sanctions against. Can anyone talk about how China may kind of disaggregate between the different extremist groups in South and Central Asia?
I'll maybe briefly offer some thoughts, if that's okay. I think that I think it's an interesting question. I actually wonder a little bit about LET, because I think LET is a group that the Chinese kind of recognize the relationship and role that it has in Pakistan. And, for that reason, there always is a sort of ambivalent thing, but they have spoken out against the group in the past and supported Indian complaints. And in the wake of, for example, the 2008 Mumbai attacks, the Chinese are very worried about what might happen, and while on the one hand, they're not great allies of India, they have always got a very contentious relationship that sort of runs hot and cold, and there's always kind of some engagement. It's worth remembering that in the Indian context, India is also a member of the SCO, as is Pakistan, by the way, and these are all countries that do regular counterterrorism exercises together. They may be fairly muted exercises per se, but they do actually show up and participate. So it's always a consideration to sort of think about within this context. But I think the key is that I don't think, the Chinese did get concerned that after 2008, and you saw this with some earlier attacks as well, with Jaish Mohammed had done in Pakistan, a kind of a level of concern in China that, oops, maybe the Pakistanis prodded the Indians too hard this time, and the consequences of that would be potentially a nuclear conflict on China's border, which it might get dragged into. And, they're bellicose, they're hubristic, yes, but I don't think they quite want to go that far, because, the bigger consequences of that are catastrophic for everybody. So I think that LET, actually, there is a kind of level of concern that does exist within China. But I actually think when we're talking about sort of different groups in the region, I would argue the ones that are probably going to be more interesting to look at in terms of Chinese counterterrorism practice are separatist groups. And I think separatist groups, and I'd say this across the kind of South Asian and even into Southeast Asian region, are interesting to look at, because in some cases, and this is particularly true in parts of Southeast Asia that China borders, and even over into South Asia, you've seen the Chinese developing relationships with some of these groups, and in some cases actively supporting them because they kind of act as a protective buffer on the other side. In some cases, because they're trying to manipulate someone against the power that they don't like. But they have done that there. And if we look over on the Pakistani side, it's always interesting to look that if we look at particularly some of the separatist groups in the country, they increasingly talk about China as their big enemy. And you can see the Chinese, recognize that this is happening. And so I suspect that when Beijing, or the local MSS or MPS man is going to his counterparts in the Pakistani government to complain about, this roster of people we don't like and we want to do something about, I think probably there's a lot of Uyghurs on that list. But actually, I think there's an increasing number of Baluchis and Sindhis and even some TTP members, because we've seen these groups starting to talk about targeting China. And I think that's a really interesting side of kind of Chinese counterterrorism practice as we go forwards, which is that as it starts to perceive that some of these other groups, militant groups that really, haven't an interest in attacking China in China, but are interested in targeting China in these third locations. And I suspect you could see some of these similar, maybe smaller scale organizations emerge potentially in Central Asia, but I think probably because of the context, it would merge slightly differently. But maybe in Southeast Asia, I think you're going to start to see Chinese counterterrorism approaches and practice going outwards, changing in a way that I think would be seen in a much more similar light in some ways to what I think, the United States or the West was doing previously, which is a much more sort of proactive role, which doesn't just necessarily focus on, the direct guys who are a threat to you, but actually looking at that in a more expansive way, recognizing that these threats are interlinked and have a multiplicity of different sort of interconnections that can cause you problems if you don't go do something about them.
Yeah, I would only add that that's an important point, because some of these groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, they have global portfolios. So they have so many different ethnic groups and international issues to focus on that oftentimes China is only one of them. And for some reason, sometimes they leave out China for several month periods. But some of these more localized groups, like in Balochistan or the Sindhi groups, they don't really have global portfolios. They're focusing on the highways running through their regions. They're focusing on construction progress, environmental issues related to port, issues related to trade, economy. And that's where China plays a huge role. So in some ways for them, China plays a much more important role in their lives and their grievances and concerns. And they're also in some ways more locally rooted in those places than some of these major groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So they come in contact with some of the local projects that China is engaging in. So they actually have more opportunities to, for example, attack a Chinese bus on a local road in some part of Balochistan. So actually, in some ways, the threat is more acute when it comes to these more regional, localized separatist outfits than the more global-oriented jihadi groups.
So, John, on this one, my throwaway bumper sticker phrase is "Welcome to the big leagues." We've actually allowed them to focus entirely on East and South China Sea regions, right? The regions they care about, most. They're going to have to figure out how to do the lobster eyeball thing here and devote significant effort and attention. Everything we just described is going to take a lot of manpower, brain power, Politburo Standing Committee debate time, and all the rest of that stuff. So, in my mind, and the track record to date has not been good in terms of being subtle, using third parties, negotiating, and the rest. So this is we heard in Kyrgyzstan, the new guy, shiny penny, welcome to Kyrgyzstan era is over, and now they're going to start working for security and economic issues and all that. Again, this takes pressure off of the bigger issues that from the defense establishment we look at in East with Taiwan and South China Sea.
Thanks. I think that's a great point. The connection between the external, external challenges and divided attention. Glenn, I think you also had a question for Dave. Do you want to jump in here quickly? Oh, you're muted.
Okay. All right. There was various questions, and I want to go back to and ask Dave. I know Dave Stillwell has to leave, but you start off a really interesting policy point by showing the different jurisdictions and how the United States has tried to deal with this region. as a whole. And you pointed out very eloquently these dividing lines within the different command structures. INDOPACOM and CENTCOM also falls in there, and even CENTCOM has a different perspective. So, Dave, if you are the next Secretary of State and day one you walk in, are you going to, when you start talking to people and saying what our strategy is one of the things you're going to do to say, look, we need a new map of how we deal with these different jurisdictions and how we think about it? Because I think that's what you're kind of alluding to, that there's all this overlap and then there's different intersections. And as you point out, I mean, Eurasia, Central Asia, South Asia, you know, there's these challenges for the United States and how we deal with it. So I'll let you just turn it over to you, just kind of share what needs to be done at the grand strategic level for the U.S.
I think you need to call somebody, a business manager, a business school professor on this one, because this is a organizational leadership issue. I'll tell you what, the first thing you want to do is reorganize. Everybody says, okay, reorganize for the task. That just doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. What you have to do is give guidance and empower and then draw, line diagrams that say you are subordinate to that effort, right? And what I would like to see is the CENTCOM commander pick up the phone and talking to the INDOPACOM commander and saying, how can I help? So short of, and we did this when I was there. My deputy assistant secretary was Atul Keshup from, a longtime South and Central Asia expert. And the goal there was just through personnel was to just kind of stitch those seams together and overcome those big black lines. So we're looking at it more holistically. And I won't bore you with, there's a lot of ways to solve this, but here's one that's just anathema to the bureaucracy is informal meetings. I set up two informal, regularly scheduled meetings like this that had no agenda. There was no invitee list. There was no readouts. It was just, let's sit around and expose each other to each other's interests. So the rest of it is, again, business school 101. But going in and trying to reorganize it isn't going to work that well. The NSC has a little bit broader view on this. Kirk Campbell is the Asia guy. This is in his job jar. That might be a place to start, is to, him convene groups to work on these things. But detonating the whole thing and starting from scratch, we've seen over and over again, doesn't work.
Great. All right, let's pivot to another question that from our audience Q&A, and this kind of picks up on what Niva was talking about earlier, which is, has the Taliban victory in Afghanistan inspired Islamic militants throughout Central Asia, and what impact could that lead to international cooperation on terrorism issues, and how is that impacting China's approach, if it has indeed kind of inspired these extremist groups? Niva, I think you might be the best person to answer that one if you can.
I will start, but I also want Raphael to follow up because I know that he's also following this and he has his own opinion. I've definitely seen a population here that is inspired by the Taliban victory. Whether or not, this will become, a more serious issue in terms of, military and, I think it's not yet to be seen, but, the way that Islamic countries have been funding certain groups to grow in this region is definitely of concern. I think, if these groups were to be interested more in politics and less in religion, then this will create very big problems for leaders here, particularly countries like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, which has very problematic leaders and problematic political transition issues that are constantly going on in Kyrgyzstan, and then also this coming one in Tajikistan. They both have populations that are undergoing very kind of bad economy, youths that are seeing no future and turning into religion. I think Taliban is definitely a factor here. And I think that, because of this, like I said, China is, definitely and particularly looking at this issue of how young people are being radicalized online. There's a lot of resources that's being poured into this. There's a lot of Chinese engagement with the local groups here to manage, the way things are spread online, and what is available to young people, what channels, what websites, and these things are constantly being blocked and monitored. So is very active, but then again, like, this requires very long-term effort to delete and monitor. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of word of mouth here. So if you go to the mosque every Friday, you can get information there as well. So even though you can delete as much as you can online, you go to the mosque, what else is there to do in Central Asia for these young people? It's definitely, rising and very concerning. And I would actually love to hear what Rafael thinks about this.
I get briefly offer some thoughts. I think Niva makes a very compelling case for how the kind of the radicalization in Central Asia is a consistent problem. I guess I think at a rhetorical level, there's no doubt that, you've seen this around the world. Groups have looked at what the Taliban achieved and said, look at what can be done. After 20 years of war with the Quran and the Kalashnikov, you can overthrow another empire, So I think that rhetoric really does resonate. And you can see that in various groups around the world. And I think that's true in Central Asia. I think the question is then, how does that translate into an actual threat on the ground? And I think that's where it's a little bit harder sometimes to discern, because while all of the issues Niva points out to are true, what does this mean for a sort of young radicalized Central Asian? Are they going to then go to Afghanistan and join the Taliban? Are they going to go join ISK? ISK is still a pretty diffuse organization that doesn't sort of have a natural place of connection that you could sort of go to in a way. I still think that from that perspective, probably what's happening in Syria and sort of in Idlib province is probably a more attractive target in some ways, because at least you kind of know where you're going to, and there's kind of established community to connect with. So I think that connection, I suspect, will probably still sort of play out in that direction, unless we see ISK starting to really establish territory and demonstrate something more than the kind of guerrilla capability I think they've demonstrated so far in Afghanistan. I think the other the one interesting country I would look at in particular, though, in the region is Tajikistan, because in Tajikistan, you have a country that has I think there's some serious questions that could be asked about, about the security capability there. And if we look at the past few years, the terrorist incidents that we have seen happen in Central Asia have happened in Tajikistan. They've been pretty brutal. And it's been cases that really the government has sort of has not really offered a tangible explanation for, but have usually involved quite a few people. And that, on top of the fact that we know that Tajik groups are fighting alongside the Taliban, who are very effective fighters that the Taliban ultimately sort of rewarded by giving control of certain parts of the north near Tajikistan. And also the sort of contentious relationship that President Rahman has established with the Taliban. He's the one who's really standing up against them. All the other Central Asians have sort of set themselves up in a situation to basically engage with the Taliban government and say, well, we don't love it, but they're here now. We've got to engage with somebody, and we'll just kind of hope that we can keep the trouble out of our borders. But in Tajikistan, the fact that you've set up this more contentious relationship, the fact that you've got these groups on the ground, the fact that you have a history of militancy recently of attacks and incidents in the country does make me worry a bit about what the consequences could be in terms of cross-border sort of militancy there. Having said all of that, of course, it's also worth caveating that, we haven't seen that many attacks ultimately going back and forth across those borders. So, it's not impossible they could happen, but I think if they were to happen, that's probably where we'd see it. So I think the rhetoric resonates, and I think it has resonated around the world. Even interesting here in Southeast Asia. But I think the tangible link, and then how does this translate into a terrorist threat in Central Asia in particular? I have a suspicion you'd see it articulating itself more likely in the short term, at least. I think in Tajikistan. Thank you.
Great. A really quick follow-on question to that, I guess, and maybe the answer is obvious, but we know that obviously it's not just Uyghurs that are being targeted through China's re-education programs and put into facilities, right? There's also been considerable number of Kazakhs and other Central Asian Muslim minorities. How much is that driving radicalization among disaffected youth in the region? Are people seeing these things, and is that driving them to join extremist groups, or is that just contributing to maybe more general alienation towards China and not necessarily pushing people towards radical Islam?
I think, yeah, that's a really good question. Let me start first. I think, it makes sense for us to think, well, why wouldn't Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan care about, the way that Kazakhs and Kyrgyz in China, in Xinjiang, has been oppressed? This is, I think it makes sense for us, very straightforward. But when you talk to people here, you ask them, why don't you care? There is a very big disconnect. People here do not see ethnic Kazakh or ethnic Kyrgyz from China as their own. Because they're born in China, they are Chinese. And this is the only region in the world where when you ask people, who is a Chinese person? Here, people has the concept that is multi-ethnic. You go to Southeast Asia, you ask them, what is the Chinese? You think Han Chinese, people that look like me. But you ask people here, they think of Chinese as Uyghurs, as Dongans, as Kazakh Kyrgyz that are born there. And they don't care, unfortunately. I think, this has not been said enough. I wish they care. But the only protest that you see happening in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, about the treatment of ethnic Kyrgyz, ethnic Kazakh, ethnic Kyrgyz in China, they are themselves from that community. And in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, these ethnic Kyrgyz and Kazakh that come from China, they are incredibly discriminated because they don't speak Russian. They speak a dialect of Kyrgyz and Kazakh that is much more the original one, and they don't understand each other culturally and in terms of language as well. The education they have is different. The kind of media, music, taste that they consume is completely different. So we cannot talk about this we cannot talk about it at all, this question itself. And, so many students, ethnic Kyrgyz students from China, just across the border, came to Bishkek to study, this past few years, they've all disappeared. They've went back to China for vacation and they've all disappeared. And no one is asking where they are. I've spoken to some member of parliament who said that they simply cannot ask this question where they are. One, because it's China. Second, because to be honest, they don't care enough about it. They will tell you that, well, we have enough problems as we have in Kyrgyzstan. We have enough problems as we have in Kazakhstan. Why care about citizens of another country? There's no such bloodline to be talked about here.
Yeah, and you might add that the states themselves, like Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, they have quite little interest in allowing for anti-Chinese sentiment to blossom. That could affect trade, it could affect SCO and other security arrangements. I mean, there's little doubt that if they start allowing anti-China protests over the Uyghur or other issues, that China will respond in kind with some measures to make life more difficult for those governments. You've even seen Turkey, which at one point around 10 years ago started to champion itself as the voice of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Even Turkey has become much more muted and made a lot of conciliatory statements toward China, and even conducted a visit to Xinjiang and voiced some pleasure or satisfaction with what it saw. So I think that's another reason why you're not seeing some local grassroots movement against China. It's simply because the states don't create the environment where that could flourish.
Great. I think that's a great point, and kind of provides some more granularity, I think, there's not necessarily this linear connection. It's an interesting contrast, I think, to maybe the Tibetan diaspora, right, which lacks, of course, there is no independent Tibetan state. So it's an interesting contrast there. I guess I will kind of try to synthesize some of these last questions here for one final question, and thank you all for being so generous with your time today. The final question is, of course, about the impact of all this on, Dave talked about it earlier, but on China's kind of all-weather friendship with Pakistan. And we know, of course, that China has invested tens of billions of dollars in Pakistan through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. We know that Pakistan's internal security situation, is obviously, I think, much better than it was 12 years ago, right? When the, when the Red Mosque was under siege, and the very kind of foundations of the Pakistani state were under pressure. But where do we see this relationship going? Is it purely going to be focused on India? Are there going to be other, areas for cooperation in Afghanistan or elsewhere? Thanks.
I'll maybe go first, and I'll look forward to hearing Jake and Niva and Glenn views on this. I think that the relationship with Pakistan is, in a very boring academic way, a complicated one. And I think the problem is that, it is a relationship where they are clearly bound together in their rhetoric and their action. They are strongly together, but China sees, as many problems in Pakistan as, frankly, the United States does, or as, frankly, anyone else does, really. And there's always the underlying concern, which maybe you can see bubbling up a little bit more now, that, maybe the Pakistanis will start to play the same sorts of games with the Chinese that they used to play with the Americans in the past. And, you can look at some of the recent shifts that we've seen in the China-Pakistan relationship. I think one of the more interesting things that we observed that happened in the past couple of years was the appointment of the ambassador. The current ambassador to Pakistan is not, as had been in all of the predecessors, a sort of long-standing South Asia hand. You notice in the Chinese MFA, all the embassies in the region in South Asia, they tended to kind of rotate amongst each other. So, people who now serve at the consulate in Karachi previously served in Delhi. A lot of them have done some time in Kabul. It's kind of a little thing. And, it's how the Chinese system operates. And it's a linguistic and, capabilities and knowledge thing as well. But what was interesting was the recent appointment of the ambassador Nong Rong was of a man who is actually a Guangxi party man. Who is supposedly potentially close to Guo Xiongkun, the Politburo man who was linked to, who's responsible for the security apparatus in China. And his appointment was an interesting one because it seemed to signal that there was a desire from Beijing to kind of solidify the party connection. Not let this be something that's run by the MFA, but actually put in a political man to really try to stiffen the relationship, because there was a level of concern that was slipping in, that CPEC wasn't going very well, projects have been slowed down, and they've just had the most recent, Joint Coordination Committee meeting, which ended in quite a flat way. It was delayed by a year, which they blamed on COVID, but was probably more about the fact that they really couldn't agree on stuff. And you've seen a general slowdown there, and you've seen a general sort of hesitation from China to really start pouring more money in to Pakistan, because they kind of want to get the situation stabilized at the moment. On top of this, we've had a real spike in the past year of incidents targeting Chinese nationals in Pakistan by not only, the Sindhi and Baluchi groups that I referred to a number of times before, but also plots linked to the TTP, and a very mysterious attack in Dasu in KPK, which logically you'd connected the TTP, but was never actually claimed by any group, which is very mysterious. 9 Chinese engineers were killed. This was definitely a successful terrorist attack by anyone's calculation, and yet no group decided to step forward and claim this, which I think raises interesting questions about who's ultimately responsible. But the point being, Chinese people are dying, incidents are happening in Pakistan, And the Pakistani state is unable to kind of provide the guarantee and security protection that China relies on them for. So all of this says to me that there are tensions within this relationship. But what I think we have to overlay on top of this is we have to not take a binary view of this. It isn't their friends or their enemies. It's not how the world works in general, but also I think in this particular context, the problem that I think China has does link into Afghanistan, which is that ultimately China has very little, if no experience in trying to deal with some of the potential security problems that emanate from Afghanistan. They've never fought an insurgent war. They've never really had an army that's gone out and fought, recently a big conflict and delivered on, really difficult security outcomes. So they need a backstop. And I still think that in the Afghan context, Pakistan acts as that backstop. So if, heaven forbid, things really start to go bad in Afghanistan, their investment, their people start to get targeted, so on and so forth, I think you'd see a lot of pressure from Beijing onto Islamabad to say, you need to get Haqqanis, whoever you know across the border, to rein in this, because this is a big problem for us. And so I think that backstop probably helps balance out, in a way, some of these other problems that China sees in Pakistan. And so I think that's going to continue to be a consideration going forward. The only final point I'd add is that China at the moment is in a situation that it wants to have visible allies on the world stage, allies who will stand up and support them when they want it to. And the Pakistanis have repeatedly showed in the South Asian context, and actually on the global stage, they're willing to be that ally. And that is important to China. So when you see the American government signing some upgrades of the security relationship with India, what happens, within a week, Wei Fenghe, the Chinese defense minister, flies to Pakistan and signs a new MOU with the Pakistani government and starts to authorize a whole new series of deals. Their way of showing, hey, you start to mess it, we've got people in this neighborhood too. So I think that Pakistan does have it's an important relationship, but I think it's one that's got tensions. But I think we have to not get too carried away in interpreting these tensions as something that ultimately could sort of, that doesn't have some sort of a durable base underpinning it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Raffaello. Let's turn now to Glen, who I think had a follow-on question for you and may have some final observations himself.
Thank you. Raffaello, you raised some really interesting points. The big policy question at this point for the United States is, what are we going to do when we know that Pakistan kind of, they were the victor in Afghanistan. I mean, their proxy won. Okay. And the US is just kind of set in sour grapes and upset about the state of the withdrawal. But you really raised some interesting points that I'll go into here, that when we had our earlier event on the US policy and USCT policy after Afghanistan withdrawal, that, you have some very senior, former senior US policymakers in the panel that we had, were basically saying, well, Pakistan is never going to be helpful. They're never going to be productive. And when I asked the question, well, okay, they won and they're still giving us air access for drone strikes in Afghanistan and providing the air corridor and the bridge, aren't they in some way still cooperating? And they said, well, yeah, they kind of have that, but they're never going to be a long-term partner of the United States. Well, if you hit on a point that in the July attacks by the Baluch on the Chinese engineers in Pakistan, I heard from Pakistani contacts that the ISI, after these attacks, they were summoned to Beijing and basically read the Riot Act and said, look, get this under control inside Pakistan. We cannot have any more attacks. And the Pakistani person I was talking to was saying, look, the Pakistanis don't like being treated this way. And they know they got to get things under control. But for the United States, I think we need to exploit some of these rifts in this new regional strategic environment in South Asia with with Pakistan clearly kind of not the dominant power, because I do see that I do see the problems with the Pakistani Taliban being a nuisance for Pakistan, Haqqanis in the government. But then the Taliban themselves are kind of quasi-Pashtun nationalists. So that being said, they may be able to control everything, and Pakistan has its own kind of calculus now. So that's, I guess, back to you, Raffaello, about, you hit on some really important points, and I think the United States is also missing on this. And because you're watching the CT and the terrorism trends, that brings up some really relevant points. So I don't know if you had to comment on that.
Well, thank you. I mean, you raised a number of very interesting and complicated points. I think, I think it's been noticeable that the US relationship with Pakistan has definitely soured. And I think there's multiple reasons for that. I think Afghanistan has kind of crystallized it all in one shape. And I think, I can understand the kind of frustration in some ways. I think the concern in some ways I have about when I think about looking at this from a kind of a Washington policy lens, I can well understand that, looking at this, there's a strong sense, well, the Chinese are kind of getting their comeuppance. They wanted us out of their backyard. We've left their backyard. Now it's their problem. They can fix it, and they can see what a nightmare it really is to try to manage. And they can deal with the Pakistanis, who are these sort of very complicated actor that blows hot and cold, is creating problems that then they're trying to resolve, but ultimately you're the one who's suffering. Let them just kind of deal with this mess. And I suppose if I take that to the next step, which is I think what you're alluding to, is that, well, how does the United States take advantage of this from a policy perspective? I think there is a danger in some ways of getting sucked back in. And I think the other danger is that these problems are sadly all interlinked. And so I think, one of the medium-term outcomes I see from the situation in Afghanistan is frankly more instability in Pakistan, because I think the groups there will take direct sustenance from what's happened in Afghanistan, and you're already starting to see that. There are links, of course, and the groups now have a place where they can sort of go and then sort of go back and forth to Scots border. The Taliban government is its own independent actor, as well as being something that's very responsive to the Pakistanis, and that tension has always sort of existed. And frankly, the government of Imran Khan has not really been able to manage some of these domestic security concerns that effectively. So I see a situation that you could see situations in Pakistan getting much worse. And the problem when problems in Pakistan get worse is that they tend not to stay in the region. The attacks of September 11, Al-Qaeda, the networks there, attacks that we saw in the United Kingdom, all ultimately had links to some of the groups that emanated from there. So my concern in some ways is that more instability in Afghanistan is, yes, a problem for China in the sort of short term and medium term and longer term, I suppose, but it also becomes a problem for everyone else in the medium to long term as well. And so in some ways, the concern is, I think, if the policy approach from Washington as well, let's try to tweak this because it'll sort of create more problems for the Chinese, which will maybe, force them to spread themselves a bit more thinly from the other side. I think there's a risk in how that ultimately plays out in the longer term, which could frankly cause trouble for everybody. So that's the sort of brief reflection I'd offer on that. I think, look, from my broader perspective, if I can briefly offer that, I think, my main hope, I think, from Washington is that, frankly, Washington stays engaged in this region. I'm recognized that, Central Asia has never been that much of a priority. Certainly my engagements in Washington over the years on Central Asia, it was never, I'd meet wonderful people at the State Department, at the Department of Defense and elsewhere, who are focused on the region, knew it incredibly well, and being America had giant budgets, which no one else did. But when you then looked at what were the priorities, never very high on the list. And I fear that now Afghanistan is probably going to slip into that bracket as well, as frankly probably is parts of Pakistan, because they'll say, well, this is now a neighborhood we're not engaged with. And I think that's a real loss, because I think American engagement in the region was actually very welcomed, for one thing. I recognize that you had these problems with Pakistan blowing sort of hot and cold, but they are desperate to have other options. They recognize their neighborhood, that it's surrounded by Iran, by Russia, by China. They would like other options. And the West is kind of an option that's very attractive to them. But, the European Union is not going to be the kind of security actor or player that they need. Washington could be, and so I think the danger in some ways is that not having this hard security presence in Afghanistan means that the US policy attention will understandably shift to lots of other places. But I think that's a missed opportunity for the United States, and if I think in really grandiose geostrategic terms to end on, let's remember our Halford Mackinder, right? The famous geographer who used to talk about the Eurasian heartland, as the geopolitical pivot of the world, and he who controls that controls the world island, Eurasia, and therefore controls the world. So I think it's an important area to stay engaged in. And I don't think this is just, historical guff.
You're absolutely spot on.
Sorry.
You're absolutely spot on. And the problem is that we stopped looking at maps in the United States and no longer look at geography and choke points and things like strategic geography, sadly. And but hopefully that'll change. John, you want to wrap it up for us?
Yeah, thanks everyone. I guess Jacob, Niva, any last 1 minute takeaways from today's discussion, things we should keep an eye on in 2022 in this in this region where so much is going on and so many challenges are taking place.
Well, hitting on some of the more macro themes, I might just say that we can
you cut out there a little bit, Jacob. Let's, are you back?
Yeah, I think I got frozen for a second.
Okay, no worries.
I'm just saying that we've seen ISIS, Al-Qaeda conflict in Africa. We've seen it in Syria. We've seen it play out in a number of theaters. And we're beginning to see it play out in Afghanistan. And I think that's an important trend to watch. One of the factors of the ISIS-Taliban rift in Afghanistan will be the Uyghur issue.
We lost Jacob.
Control. I might have frozen again. The Taliban's control of Afghanistan might be a little bit more tenuous than is believed by many. There's a lot of in ethnic groups. There's the ISIS factor. There's international geopolitical jostling. So before we say that the Taliban conquered Afghanistan, I think we still need to take a second look.
Great. I think that's a good kind of, oh, there you are. Is that a good note to go out on, Jacob, that we need to kind of look more closely at Afghanistan and not assume that it'll be dominated by the Taliban indefinitely?
I think so. I think some people have taken for granted that the Taliban won, the Taliban rules, and that's how things will be. I'm a little bit more skeptical, perhaps.
Great, thank you. All right, Niva, I know it's getting pretty late in the evening there, and thank you for and as well as for you, Raffaello. Do you have any kind of last words of wisdom or things to keep an eye on before we close up here today?
I think just one last comment. Glenn was talking about how can the U.S. exploit, the current situation and, Pakistan, Afghanistan, everything. I think, this year we see that Uzbekistan is growing very close with the U.S. And this is the perfect opportunity to exploit what's going on in Afghanistan. Linking Uzbekistan to Afghanistan and Pakistan is already what the Uzbek leaders want, and is what they're asking for. So I was very happy to see that US Aid is finally opening an office in Tashkent. I was very happy to see, growing US presence there in projects in Uzbekistan. So let's, keep going.
Great. It's a great point. Okay, I think that closes us up well. So much to think about here today. These issues are so complex and multifaceted, and thank you all for talking us through them. Encourage everyone to visit jamestown.org for our coverage of these issues, both in Terrorism Monitor, which is edited by Jacob, and China Brief, which is edited by myself, and then Eurasia Daily Monitor, which will also take a look at these things, especially through Central Asia and Russia's role. Finally, I'll say that if you missed part or some of the event today, it'll be available on YouTube and will live on in posterity there. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and wish you best wishes in the new year, and hope to see you at Jamestown events in 2022.
Merry Christmas.
Take care, everybody.
Take care, bye.
Take care.